The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Sierra Vista, Arizona, causing Mary Parker to flinch violently as she scrubbed the wooden porch of the town's only boarding house. Her trembling hands clutched the brush tighter, knuckles white with tension as memories flooded back memories of another time when loud noises meant pain would soon follow. Sierra Vista in 1875 was a town caught between its wild frontier past and an emerging future of order and civilization. The railroad had arrived 2 years prior, bringing with it an influx of settlers, businessmen, and the occasional troublemaker. For 26-year-old Mary, it had brought the promise of escape, though the chains of her past still bound her tightly. Mary had been working at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house for nearly 8 months now, ever since she'd stepped off the train with nothing but a small carpet bag containing her meager possessions and the fading bruises that told a story she never spoke of. The elderly widow had taken one look at Mary's hunched shoulders and downcast eyes and offered her a position without asking questions about the past Mary was clearly running from. "Mary, are you still working on that porch?" Mrs. Holloway called from inside. "It's near noon already." "Yes, madam," Mary responded quietly, her voice barely audible above the bustling sounds of the main street. "Almost finished." Mary tucked a strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear, wincing as her fingers brushed against the small scar at her temple, a permanent reminder of her former life in Chicago. A life with a husband whose charming smile in public had masked a monster behind closed doors. Another commotion drew her attention to the street, where a group of cowboys had just ridden into town. Mary instinctively shrank back against the wall of the boarding house, making herself as small and invisible as possible. Men on horseback, particularly those with liquor on their breath, still triggered a primal fear in her that no amount of distance from Chicago could erase. The men dismounted at the hitching post across the street, in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon. Most were young and boisterous, laughing and shoving one another as they headed inside for midday refreshment. All except one. He stood a head taller than the rest, his broad shoulders straight beneath a dust-covered denim jacket. Unlike his companions, he didn't rush toward the promise of whiskey and card games. Instead, he carefully tended to his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, removing the saddle with practiced care and checking the animal's legs with gentle hands. Mary found herself watching him, momentarily forgetting her task. There was something different about the way he moved, deliberate, patient, with none of the swagger or bravado of the others. When he finished with his horse, he patted the animal's neck affectionately before reaching into his saddlebag to retrieve something. It was only when he turned toward the general store that Mary caught a glimpse of his face. Sun-bronzed skin, a strong jawline softened somewhat by a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that, even from a distance, seemed to hold a quiet strength. He couldn't have been more than 30. "Mary," Mrs. Holloway's voice shattered her trance. "The water's getting cold." Mary startled, realizing she'd been staring. Heat rushed to her cheeks as she gathered her cleaning supplies and hurried inside, keeping her eyes firmly on the wooden planks beneath her feet. "Sorry, Mrs. Holloway," she murmured, rushing past the older woman toward the kitchen. The widow's stern expression softened. "It's all right, dear, I just don't want you working in this heat any longer than necessary." She peered more closely at Mary's flushed face. "Are you feeling well? You look feverish." "I'm fine," Mary assured her, embarrassed by her reaction to the stranger. "Just the sun, I think." Later that evening, as Mary served dinner to the boarding house residents, a traveling salesman, an elderly schoolteacher, and a young married couple passing through on their way to California, the bell above the door jingled. Mrs. Holloway hurried to greet the newcomer, and Mary nearly dropped the pot of stew she was carrying when she saw who had entered. It was the cowboy from earlier, his hat now in his hands, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Evening, madam," he said to Mrs. Holloway, his voice deep but gentle. "I heard you might have a room available. My crew and I will be in town for a few weeks helping with the Mitchell Ranch roundup." Mrs. Holloway beamed. "Indeed we do, mister." Lawson, Benjamin Lawson, but most folks call me Ben. Well, Mr. Lawson, we certainly have room. The other establishments in town tend to be a bit lively for those who prefer a peaceful night's sleep. Ben smiled, and Mary noticed how it reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. That's precisely why I'm here, madam. My working days start early, and I've long outgrown the appeal of sleeping above a saloon, Mrs. Holloway chuckled. Wise man, Mary will show you to your room after you've had some supper. You've arrived just in time. At the mention of her name, Mary froze, her eyes widening as both Mrs. Holloway and Ben turned to look at her. She quickly averted her gaze, staring intently at the floor. Mary, dear, set another place at the table for Mr. Lawson, Mrs. Holloway instructed gently. Mary nodded, hurrying to the kitchen without meeting Ben's eyes. Her hands shook as she gathered another plate, cup, and utensils. She hadn't been this close to a strange man in months, not since she'd fled Chicago in the dead of night, her ribs still aching from her husband's latest outburst. When she returned to the dining room, she carefully set the place at the far end of the table, as distant from her own seat as possible. Throughout the meal, she kept her eyes on her plate, speaking only when directly addressed, offering one-word answers when possible. She could feel Ben's occasional glances, but to her relief, he didn't try to engage her in conversation. Instead, he spoke respectfully with Mrs. Holloway about the boarding house, the town, and the weather, which had been unseasonably dry even for Arizona territory. After dinner, Mary reluctantly led Ben upstairs to the last available room at the end of the hallway. "This will be your room, Mr. Lawson," she said quietly, keeping her distance as she pushed open the door. "There's fresh water in the pitcher. Breakfast is at 6, Mrs. Holloway asks that no smoking be done indoors." She recited the rules mechanically, eager to complete her task and retreat. "Thank you kindly, Miss Parker," Ben replied, staying well back to give her space. His perceptiveness surprised her, making her glance up briefly. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment before she looked away again. "If you need anything else, please ask Mrs. Holloway," she added hastily, already backing toward the stairs. "I appreciate your help," Ben said softly. "Good night." Mary nodded once before practically fleeing down the stairs to the safety of the kitchen, where she threw herself into washing the dinner dishes with unnecessary vigor. Mrs. Holloway watched her with knowing eyes but said nothing, merely drying the plates Mary handed her in companionable silence. It wasn't until they were nearly finished that the older woman spoke. "He seems like a gentleman," she remarked casually, Mary's hands stilled in the soapy water. "I wouldn't know about such things," she replied, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Holloway sighed. "Not all men are like the one who gave you that scar, Mary." Mary's hand reflexively went to her temple, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. In the 8 months she'd been in Sierra Vista, she'd never spoken of her past, but Mrs. Holloway was perceptive. The widow had never pressed for details, but her gentle understanding had been a balm to Mary's wounded spirit. "Maybe not," Mary conceded, "but enough of them are." The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising another scorching Arizona day. Mary rose before the sun, as was her habit, to help prepare breakfast for the boarding house guests. She was kneading dough for biscuits when she heard the front door open and close quietly. Curious, she peered through the kitchen window and saw Ben Lawson walking toward the stables across the street, likely to check on his horse before heading to the Mitchell Ranch. There was something about his purposeful stride, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence rather than swagger, that made her watch him longer than she intended. When he returned a short while later, Mary quickly busied herself with the biscuits, not wanting to be caught staring again. She remained in the kitchen while Mrs. Holloway served breakfast, only emerging to clear plates once most of the guests had departed. Ben was the last to leave the table, finishing his coffee as Mary gathered the remaining dishes. "That was the finest breakfast I've had in months, Miss Parker," he said, his deep voice causing her to nearly drop a plate. Mary hadn't expected him to know she'd cooked the meal. "Thank you," she murmured, not meeting his gaze. "Those biscuits especially," he continued, his tone gentle and unassuming, "reminded me of my mother's. Despite herself, Mary glanced up. "You're from the South?" she asked, noting the slight drawl in his speech. A flicker of surprise crossed Ben's face at her question, likely the longest sentence she'd spoken to him thus far. "Tennessee originally," he confirmed with a small smile. "Left when I was 16, been working cattle drives ever since." Mary nodded, returning her attention to the dishes. She felt the weight of his gaze, patient and undemanding. "Well, I should head out," he finally said, rising from his chair. "The Mitchell Ranch won't round up its own cattle." As he reached the door, he paused. "Miss Parker," Mary looked up reluctantly, "thank you again for the fine meal." With that, he placed his hat on his head and was gone, leaving Mary with an odd, fluttering sensation in her chest that she quickly tamped down. The day passed in its usual routine, washing linens, sweeping floors, preparing lunch for the remaining guests, and helping Mrs. Holloway with the weekly grocery shopping. Mary was careful to keep her eyes lowered whenever they ventured into town, avoiding the curious glances of townspeople who, even after 8 months, still regarded her as a novelty, the quiet young woman with secrets in her eyes. When they passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, Mary heard raucous laughter spilling through the batwing doors. She instinctively moved closer to Mrs. Holloway, her body tensing. "It's all right, dear," the older woman soothed, understanding without words. "We're almost done." They were approaching the general store when the doors of the saloon burst open and 3 men stumbled out, clearly deep in their cups despite the early hour. Mary recognized them as cowboys who had ridden in with Ben the day before, though he was nowhere in sight. "Well, look what we have here," one of them slurred, stepping directly into their path. "The mouse from the boarding house." Mary felt herself grow cold with fear, her breath catching in her throat. She took a step backward. "Move aside, Mr. Cooper," Mrs. Holloway demanded firmly. "We have business to attend to." "Just being friendly," the man protested, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Mary. "Ain't seen nothing so pretty in months of driving cattle. Thought I'd introduce myself proper." He took a step closer, and Mary could smell the whiskey on his breath. Her mind flashed back to another time, another place, another man with alcohol fueling his rage. Her hand trembled violently around the basket she carried. "That's quite enough," came a commanding voice from behind them. Ben Lawson dismounted his horse in one fluid motion, his expression hard as he approached. The drunken cowboys sobered somewhat at the sight of him. "Boss," one of them started, "we were just making fools of yourselves and harassing ladies in broad daylight," Ben finished for him, his voice cold. "Get back to the ranch. Now, we've got work to do, and clearly you've had enough town time." The men hesitated only briefly before shuffling toward their horses, muttering under their breath. Ben turned to Mrs. Holloway and Mary, his expression softening. "My apologies for my men's behavior, ladies. I assure you it won't happen again." Mrs. Holloway nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson." Mary couldn't speak, couldn't even look up. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it, and her legs felt as though they might give way beneath her at any moment. "Miss Parker," Ben said gently, keeping a respectful distance, "are you all right?" Mary managed a jerky nod, still clutching her basket like a shield. "Would you ladies allow me to escort you to the general store?" he offered, no trace of demand in his voice. "I need to pick up some supplies myself." Mrs. Holloway accepted graciously, and Mary followed in silence, focusing on her breathing as they continued down the street. Ben walked slightly ahead, giving Mary the space she so desperately needed. She noticed how he positioned himself between them and any other men they passed, creating a buffer of safety without crowding her. At the general store, he tipped his hat and moved to a different section, allowing them to shop in peace. When they finished their purchases, he was waiting outside with his own supplies loaded on his horse. "May I walk you ladies back to the boarding house?" he asked, again making it a question rather than an assumption. Mary remained silent during the short walk, but as they reached the porch of the boarding house, she gathered her courage. "Thank you," she said softly, addressing Ben directly for the first time, "for your intervention." Ben's smile was gentle, his eyes kind. "No thanks needed, Miss Parker." "No lady should be made to feel uncomfortable." He tipped his hat again. I'll see you both this evening." As he turned to leave, Mary watched him go, a curious warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in a very long while, she had encountered a man whose presence didn't fill her with dread, and she wasn't quite sure what to make of that. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Ben would rise early, often before Mary, and see to his horse before returning for breakfast. Each morning, he would offer a simple compliment about the food, nothing effusive, nothing that demanded response, before departing for the Mitchell Ranch. In the evenings, he would return tired but never irritable, eating his dinner with quiet appreciation and occasionally sharing a story from his day when prompted by Mrs. Holloway. He never approached Mary directly, never cornered her in hallways or tried to engage her in lengthy conversation. Instead, he offered small, consistent kindnesses, holding doors, carrying heavy loads when he happened upon her struggling with laundry baskets, and always maintaining a respectful distance. It was on the 5th day of his stay that something shifted. Mary was in the kitchen garden behind the boarding house, harvesting vegetables for the evening meal when she heard the back gate open. She tensed instantly, her fingers tightening around the knife she was using to cut lettuce. "Miss Parker," Ben's voice came soft and clear from several yards away. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you were out here. I apologize for startling you." Mary relaxed marginally, though she kept the knife close. "It's all right," she replied, not looking up from her task. "I wanted to ask a favor if you're willing," he continued, remaining by the gate. "One of the young calves at the Mitchell Ranch has taken ill. My mother used to make a tea with willow bark and some other herbs that seem to help livestock through such ailments. Mrs. Holloway thought you might know of something similar." Mary glanced up, surprised. "I do know some herbal remedies," she admitted. "My grandmother taught me." Ben's face brightened. "Would you be willing to share your knowledge? Mr. Mitchell can't afford to lose any more calves this season." There was something about the genuine concern in his voice, the complete lack of artifice, that compelled Mary to nod. "I can prepare something. I'll need to gather some ingredients." "I'd be happy to accompany you if you need to collect anything from outside the garden," Ben offered, then quickly added, "or I can wait here, whatever makes you most comfortable." Mary considered for a moment. The woods where she would need to gather willow bark were not far, but they were isolated. The thought of being alone with any man still sent fear coursing through her veins. Yet something about Ben's patient demeanor, the way he had proven consistently respectful over the past days, made her hesitate. "You can come," she said finally, setting down her basket. "I'll need help carrying what we gather." If Ben was surprised by her acceptance, he didn't show it. He simply nodded, his expression reflecting nothing but calm gratitude. As they walked the short distance to the small creek that ran east of town, Mary maintained a careful space between them. Ben filled the silence with talk of the ranch, the cattle, and the land, neutral topics that required no personal disclosures from Mary. At the creek, Mary pointed out the willow trees. "We need the inner bark," she explained, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke of things she knew well. "And some of these," she added, kneeling to gather small purple flowers growing near the water's edge. Ben watched with genuine interest. "You know a great deal about plants." Mary nodded, focusing on her task. "My grandmother was a midwife in Pennsylvania. She taught me which plants heal and which harm." "A valuable skill," Ben remarked, helping gather what she indicated, "especially out here where doctors are scarce." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the tension in Mary's shoulders gradually easing. When they had collected enough, they started back toward town. "May I ask how you came to Sierra Vista?" Ben inquired, his tone conversational rather than probing. Mary stiffened slightly. "I needed a change," she said after a long moment, her standard response to the rare occasions when someone asked about her past. Ben nodded, accepting her vague answer without pressing. "I understand that feeling. I left Tennessee looking for something different myself. Did you find it?" Mary asked, surprising herself with her curiosity. A thoughtful expression crossed Ben's face. "Parts of it," he replied honestly. "I found work I'm good at, land I love, found peace in the wide open spaces." He glanced at her. Still looking for some pieces, though. Something in his candor, the absence of pretense, made Mary brave. I came from Chicago, she offered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue after so long keeping her past locked away. Ben seemed to understand the significance of her disclosure. Quite a change coming to Arizona territory from a big city like Chicago. That was the point, Mary said softly, her eyes on the path ahead. Ben was quiet for a moment. Sometimes the best thing a person can do is start fresh somewhere new, he finally said. Takes courage, though. Mary glanced at him, caught off guard by his words. No one had ever suggested that her flight had been an act of courage rather than cowardice. When they returned to the boarding house, Mary prepared the remedy for the sick calf, explaining each step to Ben as she worked. There was comfort in focusing on the task, in sharing knowledge that was hers alone. The calf should drink this twice a day, she instructed as she handed him the finished preparation, morning and evening for 3 days. Ben accepted the bottle carefully. Thank you, Miss Parker. I'm in your debt. It's nothing, she demurred, suddenly self-conscious under his appreciative gaze. It's not nothing, he countered gently. It's kindness and skill freely given. That's something valuable indeed. After he left, Mary found herself thinking about their conversation by the creek, about the way Ben had listened without demanding more than she was willing to give. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she had spent time in a man's company without fear knotting her stomach or memories of pain clouding her mind. It was a small step, but a significant one. The next morning at breakfast, Ben reported that the calf had already shown improvement after just 1 dose of Mary's remedy. Mr. Mitchell is mighty grateful, he told her as she refilled his coffee cup. Said to tell you he'd pay for your services. Mary shook her head. That's not necessary. I'm glad I could help. That's what I told him you'd say, Ben replied with a smile. So he's sending over some fresh beef and milk instead, says it's not charity, just fair trade. Mary found herself returning his smile, if briefly. That's very kind. Throughout the day, she found herself looking forward to evening, to hearing whether the calf had continued to improve. When Ben returned that night, dusty and tired but satisfied with the day's work, she actually sought him out in the parlor after dinner. How is the calf? She asked, hovering in the doorway, ready to retreat if necessary. Ben looked up from his newspaper, pleasant surprise evident in his expression. Much better. Standing on her own and even nursing a bit. Your remedy is working wonders, Miss Parker. Mary nodded, pleased. Good. The willow bark helps with fever, and the purple flowers. Would you care to sit? Ben interrupted gently, indicating the chair across from him. I'd be interested to learn more about the properties of these plants if you're willing to share. Mary hesitated, her instinct to flee warring with an unexpected desire to continue the conversation. Finally, she perched on the edge of the chair, maintaining her escape route to the door. My grandmother called those purple flowers fever bane, she began tentatively. They grow near water and bloom, even in the heat of summer. For nearly half an hour, Mary found herself explaining various plants and their medicinal uses, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. Ben listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than mere politeness. When the grandfather clock in the corner struck 9, Mary suddenly realized how long they had been talking. I should help Mrs. Holloway finish the kitchen chores, she said, rising quickly. Of course, Ben replied, standing as well but making no move to follow or detain her. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, Miss Parker. I've learned a great deal. As Mary headed toward the kitchen, she realized her heart was beating faster not from fear, but from the novel experience of being truly heard, of having her knowledge valued. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten. The next morning, Mary found a small bundle on the kitchen table when she came down to begin breakfast preparations. Inside was a book, a compendium of medicinal plants of the American Southwest, with a simple note. Thought you might find this interesting. With appreciation, B. Lawson. Mary ran her fingers over the leather-bound cover, a lump forming in her throat at the thoughtful gesture. The book must have cost a fair portion of a cowboy's wages, yet there was nothing in the gift that suggested expectation or obligation. It was simply a recognition of her interests, her knowledge. When Ben came down for breakfast, Mary managed to meet his eyes briefly. "Thank you for the book," she said softly. "It was very thoughtful." "You're welcome," he replied with a warm smile. "I noticed the general store had it when I was picking up supplies yesterday. Seemed like something you'd appreciate." As the days passed, Mary found herself slowly, cautiously emerging from the protective shell she had built around herself. She began to join the dinner table conversations rather than merely serving the food and retreating to the kitchen. She still startled at loud noises and kept a careful distance from male guests, but with Ben, she found herself relaxing incrementally. Their conversations became a regular occurrence, often centered on neutral topics like plants, animals, or the changing landscape of the territory. Ben never pressed for personal details, never commented on her skittishness, and always ensured she had a clear path to exit any room they shared. It was during their third week of acquaintance that the nightmares returned. Mary woke in the dark hours before dawn, a scream caught in her throat, her nightdress soaked with sweat as the phantom pain of remembered blows faded from her body. In her dream, her husband had found her, dragging her back to Chicago by her hair while the people of Sierra Vista watched impassively. Unable to return to sleep, she crept downstairs to the kitchen, intending to start breakfast preparations early. To her surprise, a lamp was already lit, casting a warm glow over the familiar space. Ben sat at the small table, a cup of coffee in his hands, his eyes tired but alert. He looked up at her entrance but made no sudden movements. "Miss Parker," he greeted her quietly, "I hope I didn't wake you." Mary shook her head, hesitating in the doorway. "No, I couldn't sleep." Ben nodded understandingly. "Neither could I. The coffee's fresh if you'd like some." After a moment's deliberation, Mary entered the kitchen and poured herself a cup, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table. "Bad dreams?" Ben asked gently, his eyes on his coffee rather than on her, giving her space to answer or not as she chose. Mary's hands tightened around her cup. "Yes," she admitted, the word barely audible. Ben nodded. "I get them too sometimes, from the war." Mary glanced up, surprised. "You fought in the war, last year of it," he confirmed. "I was young, barely 17, but old enough to see things no one should have to see." He took a sip of his coffee. "The dreams come less often now, but they still come." There was something in his quiet admission of vulnerability that loosened a knot inside Mary's chest. "Mine are about," she began, then faltered. "You don't have to tell me," Ben assured her. "Just know you're not alone in having ghosts that follow you." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional sipping of coffee the only sounds breaking the pre-dawn stillness. "My husband," Mary finally said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. "My dreams are about my husband." Ben's expression remained steady, though something flickered in his eyes, not pity but a deep understanding. "I figured as much," he said softly. "The scar by your temple, the way you flinch when men raise their voices or move too quickly." Mary touched the scar reflexively. "You noticed." "I notice a lot of things," Ben replied. "Comes from years of reading cattle, weather patterns, land. People aren't so different." "He was charming," Mary found herself saying, the words spilling out after years of silence. "When we first met. Everyone thought I was so lucky to catch the eye of Edward Parker, the successful businessman. My parents were thrilled." She stared into her coffee. "The first time he hit me was 2 weeks after the wedding, said I'd embarrassed him at a dinner party. I believed him, thought it was my fault." Ben remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "It got worse over the years. I tried to leave once early on. He found me at my parents' home. They sent me back with him, said marriage was about compromise." A bitter laugh escaped her. As if what was happening was a simple disagreement about household accounts. "It wasn't your fault," Ben said, his voice low but firm. "Not ever." Mary looked up, meeting his gaze fully for perhaps the first time since they'd met. His eyes held no judgment, only a steady conviction that made her want to believe him. "I know that now," she said. "Most days, but sometimes." The doubts creep back in, Ben finished for her, the wondering if maybe you could have done something differently. Mary nodded, a lump forming in her throat. I used to think that about the war, Ben continued. About the men I couldn't save. Took me years to understand that some things are beyond our control, no matter how much we wish otherwise. They sat in silence again, but it was a different quality of silence now, one built on shared understanding rather than fear and caution. How did you get away? Ben asked finally. He came home drunk one night, Mary replied, her voice steady despite the painful memories. Worse than usual. I thought he might actually kill me this time. When he finally passed out, I took what little money I had saved and left, walked to the train station in the middle of the night and bought a ticket for the furthest destination I could afford. Sierra Vista, Ben said. Mary nodded. I'd never even heard of it before, just saw it on the board and chose it because it was far from Chicago. She took a deep breath. I've been afraid every day that he'll find me. That's what the nightmare was about. Ben was quiet for a moment, considering, does he know where you are? I don't think so. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my parents. I haven't written to anyone back east. She set her cup down with a shaky hand. But he's a determined man, and he doesn't like losing what he considers his property. You're not property, Ben said, a rare edge entering his voice. You're a person of worth and dignity. Mary's eyes filled with tears at his words, so simply stated yet so profound to someone who had been treated as less than human for so long. Thank you, she whispered. Ben reached across the table, not to touch her, but to place his open palm on the worn wood surface between them. If you ever feel unsafe, if you ever think he's found you, you can tell me. I won't let any harm come to you. Mary looked at his outstretched hand, then slowly, tentatively, placed her own palm beside it, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. It was as much trust as she could offer, and from the gentle smile that crossed Ben's face, she knew he understood the significance of the gesture. As dawn broke outside the kitchen windows, Mary felt something shift inside her, a small seed of hope taking root where only fear and doubt had grown for so long. The days that followed their pre-dawn conversation brought subtle changes to Mary's interactions with Ben. She no longer stiffened when he entered a room, no longer kept her eyes downcast when they spoke. During their evening conversations, she allowed herself to sit more comfortably, less poised for immediate flight. Ben, for his part, continued his pattern of consistent, patient kindness. He brought her interesting plants he found during his work at the ranch, knowing her interest in their medicinal properties. He carried heavy loads without being asked, fixed loose boards on the porch, and always telegraphed his movements around her, ensuring she never felt trapped or startled. One evening, about a month after Ben had first arrived at the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway announced she needed to visit her sister in Tucson for a few days. She's taken ill, and there's no one else to care for her, the widow explained as she packed a small traveling bag. I hate to leave you with all the work, Mary, but I trust you to manage the house in my absence. Of course, Mary assured her, though internally she felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect of being alone with the boarding house guests, especially the traveling salesman who had arrived the day before and whose overly familiar manner reminded her uncomfortably of Edward. After seeing Mrs. Holloway off on the afternoon stage, Mary returned to the boarding house to prepare dinner. She was kneading dough for bread when she heard the front door open and close, followed by heavy footsteps in the parlor. Tensing, she reached for the kitchen knife, holding it close as she peered through the doorway. The traveling salesman, Mr. Wilkins, was rummaging through the liquor cabinet, helping himself to Mrs. Holloway's private stock of brandy. When he turned and saw Mary watching, a slow smile spread across his face. "Ah, Miss Parker," he said, his voice overly cordial. "I was just looking for a little refreshment. Care to join me?" He held up the bottle, taking a step toward the kitchen. Mary tightened her grip on the knife, keeping it hidden in the folds of her apron. "That brandy isn't for guests, Mr. Wilkins. Mrs. Holloway keeps it for medicinal purposes only." His smile faltered slightly. "Well, what the old lady doesn't know won't hurt her, will it?" He took another step closer, and Mary could smell the alcohol already on his breath, indicating this wasn't his first drink of the day. Besides, we could have a nice little chat, you and I, get to know each other better now that we have the place to ourselves. Mary's heart pounded against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. Dinner will be served at 6, Mr. Wilkins. Until then, I have work to do. She started to back into the kitchen, but Wilkins moved surprisingly quickly, blocking the doorway. Don't be unfriendly now, he said, his tone hardening. Pretty girl like you should smile more. The words, so similar to things Edward had said before his mood would turn dark, sent a chill through Mary's body. Please move aside, she requested, her voice betraying a slight tremor despite her efforts. Wilkins' expression changed, the false charm giving way to something uglier. Think you're too good for me, is that it? He demanded, taking another step forward. I've seen how you are with that cowboy, though, always making eyes at him over dinner. Mary backed up until she hit the kitchen table, her fingers clenched so tightly around the knife handle that her knuckles whitened. Mr. Lawson has nothing to do with this, she said. I'm asking you to leave the kitchen and return to your room until dinner is ready. Wilkins laughed, an unpleasant sound that made Mary's skin crawl. Or what? You'll tell the widow when she gets back. She'll believe a paying customer over a woman with no family, no connections. He reached out suddenly, grabbing Mary's wrist. Come on now, just one little drink with me. Mary reacted instinctively, bringing the knife up between them. Let go of me, she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. Wilkins' eyes widened at the sight of the blade, then narrowed dangerously. You threatening me, girl? He growled, his grip tightening painfully on her wrist. That's not very hospitable. The lady asked you to let her go. The deep voice from the back door made both Mary and Wilkins turn. Ben stood in the doorway, his expression calm but his eyes hard as flint as he assessed the situation. This isn't your business, cowboy, Wilkins snapped, though his grip on Mary's wrist loosened slightly. I'm making it my business, Ben replied evenly. He didn't move from the doorway, didn't make any threatening gestures, but something in his stance made it clear he wouldn't be backing down. Now let go of Miss Parker and step away. For a tense moment, Mary thought Wilkins might refuse. Then, with a disgusted sound, he released her wrist and stepped back. You folks in this backward town have no sense of hospitality, he muttered, grabbing the brandy bottle and stalking out of the kitchen. Once he was gone, Mary sagged against the table, the knife clattering from her suddenly nerveless fingers. She was trembling, she realized, fine tremors running through her entire body. Ben approached slowly, keeping a respectful distance. Are you hurt? He asked quietly. Mary shook her head, though she rubbed her wrist where Wilkins' fingers had left red marks. How did you know? She managed to ask. I didn't, Ben admitted. I came back early because one of the horses threw a shoe, lucky timing. He glanced toward the doorway where Wilkins had disappeared. Would you like me to ask him to leave the boarding house? Mary considered the question. Part of her wanted to say yes, to banish the unpleasant man and the fear he had stirred in her. But another part, a part that was growing stronger with each day in Sierra Vista, recognized that she couldn't always rely on others to fight her battles. No, she decided finally. He paid for 3 nights. Mrs. Holloway would expect me to honor that. She straightened her shoulders. But I would appreciate it if you stayed close during his remaining time here. Ben nodded, respect evident in his eyes. Of course, whatever you need. Mary picked up the knife, placing it back on the cutting board. I should finish preparing dinner. May I help? Ben offered. I'm not much of a cook, but I can follow directions. The offer surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have by now. You don't have to. I know, he replied simply. I'd like to if you're comfortable with it. After a brief hesitation, Mary nodded. You could peel those potatoes, she suggested, pointing to a basket on the counter. As they worked side by side in the kitchen, Mary found her trembling subsiding, replaced by a curious warmth. Ben kept up a gentle stream of conversation about his day at the ranch. Nothing that required much response from her, just comforting background to the rhythmic sounds of cooking. By the time dinner was ready to be served, Mary felt steady again, centered in a way she wouldn't have thought possible so soon after Wilkins' unwelcome advance. The meal itself was a tense affair. Wilkins ate quickly and sullenly, avoiding both Mary's and Ben's eyes, while the other guests, an elderly couple passing through on their way to California, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of tension. After dinner, Ben stationed himself in the parlor with a book, positioned where he could see both the front door and the stairs. Mary finished her kitchen duties and then, rather than retreating to her room as she normally would, joined Ben in the parlor with her mending basket. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the turning of pages and the soft whisper of needle through fabric. Outside, the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, casting long shadows through the parlor windows. "Thank you," Mary said finally, her eyes on her needlework. "For earlier," Ben looked up from his book. "You had the situation under control," he replied. "You were defending yourself, I just provided some backup." Mary glanced up, surprised by his assessment. Most men would have claimed to have rescued her, painted her as helpless without their intervention. But Ben saw her strength, acknowledged her agency in the situation. "Still, I'm grateful you were there," she said. Ben's smile was warm. "That's what friends do for each other, isn't it? Stand beside one another when things get difficult. Friends." The word echoed in Mary's mind, bringing with it a rush of emotion. She had been so focused on survival, on building walls around herself for protection, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have a friend. "Yes," she agreed softly. "I suppose it is." The next 2 days passed without further incident from Wilkins, who seemed content to avoid both Mary and Ben as much as possible. When he finally departed, Mary felt a weight lift from her shoulders. That evening, after the other guests had retired for the night, she found herself once again in the parlor with Ben. The room was warm and cozy, lit by the soft glow of oil lamps and the dying embers in the fireplace. "Mrs. Holloway returns tomorrow," Mary commented as she organized her sewing box. Ben nodded, closing the book he'd been reading. "I'm sure she'll be pleased with how well you've managed everything in her absence." Mary smiled slightly. "It wasn't so difficult in the end," she hesitated, then added, "especially with your help." "Happy to be of service," Ben replied with a small bow of his head. He studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when I first met you, you rarely smiled. It's good to see it more often now." Mary felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I didn't have much to smile about for a long time," she admitted. "And now?" Ben asked gently. Mary considered the question, surprised by the answer that came to mind. "Now I'm starting to remember what it's like to feel, not afraid all the time." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "To feel that perhaps the future might hold something other than just survival." Ben's eyes warmed with understanding. "That's a precious thing, that feeling, worth protecting and nurturing." "Yes," Mary agreed softly, "I'm beginning to see that." As they sat in comfortable silence, Mary realized that something fundamental had shifted within her. The constant knot of fear that had lived in her chest for so long had loosened, making room for other emotions: hope, peace, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name, something that fluttered to life whenever Ben smiled at her: Mrs. Holloway returned the following afternoon, full of stories about her sister's recovery and the latest Tucson gossip. She praised Mary for keeping everything running smoothly in her absence, then shooed her off to rest while she prepared dinner herself. "You look different," the widow observed as Mary was leaving the kitchen. "More at ease," Mary paused in the doorway. "I feel different," she admitted. "Stronger, perhaps." Mrs. Holloway's eyes crinkled with understanding. "Good, it's about time." The weeks that followed brought more subtle changes. Mary began venturing into town on her own for short errands, her steps growing more confident with each successful trip. She started attending Sunday services at the small church on the edge of town, sitting in a back pew where she could observe without feeling observed throughout it all. Ben remained a steady, supportive presence. His work at the Mitchell Ranch continued, though he mentioned that it would be concluding soon as the cattle drive preparations were nearly complete. The thought of his departure created an unexpected ache in Mary's chest, one she tried to ignore but found herself dwelling on during quiet moments. She had come to rely on their evening conversations, on his gentle humor and unwavering respect. The prospect of returning to the isolation she had wrapped around herself before his arrival was increasingly unappealing. One warm evening in late April, Ben invited Mary to walk with him after dinner. "The sunset promises to be spectacular tonight," he explained, "and there's something I'd like to show you if you're willing." Curious, Mary agreed, though she made sure Mrs. Holloway knew where they were going and when to expect them back, a precaution she still took seriously. They walked toward the outskirts of town, where the buildings gave way to open land dotted with mesquite and palo verde trees. The sky was indeed beginning to transform, bands of gold and crimson stretching across the western horizon. "It's just over this ridge," Ben said as they climbed a gentle slope. "I found it while exploring on my day off last week." When they reached the top, Mary gasped softly. Before them lay a small, hidden valley, its floor carpeted with wildflowers in vibrant shades of purple, yellow, and white, a rare desert bloom brought on by the recent spring rains. "It's beautiful," she breathed, taking in the unexpected riot of color against the typically arid landscape. "I thought you might appreciate it," Ben replied, his voice warm with pleasure at her reaction. "Especially given your interest in plants, I recognized some of the ones you've described from your grandmother's teachings." They made their way carefully down into the valley, where Ben pointed out various flowers and asked Mary about their properties. She found herself explaining which could be used for teas to soothe coughs, which might help reduce fevers, which were purely decorative but beautiful nonetheless. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the valley and painting the sky in increasingly dramatic hues, they found a smooth boulder to sit on and watch the spectacle. "I've been meaning to tell you," Ben said after a companionable silence. "The Mitchell job is finishing up. The cattle drive to Kansas starts next week." Although Mary had been expecting this news, hearing it confirmed made her heart sink. "You'll be leaving then," she said, working to keep her voice neutral. Ben turned slightly to face her, his expression serious. "That depends." Mary met his gaze questioningly. "On what?" "On whether there's a reason for me to come back to Sierra Vista afterward," he replied, his voice soft but clear. Mary's pulse quickened. "What kind of reason?" Ben took a deep breath. "Mary, I've grown to care for you deeply these past weeks. I admire your strength, your resilience, your kindness. I enjoy our conversations more than anything else in my day." He paused, watching her face carefully. "I understand if you're not ready for more, if you need more time, or if you don't feel the same way. I'll respect whatever you decide." Mary looked away toward the sunset that now blazed across the western sky. Her feelings for Ben had grown steadily, evolving from cautious appreciation to genuine affection and beyond. But the prospect of acknowledging those feelings, of allowing herself to be vulnerable again, was terrifying. "I do care for you," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I thought I could ever care for anyone again, but I'm afraid, Ben, not of you," she added quickly, seeing his expression. "Of myself, of trusting my own judgment after being so terribly wrong before." Ben nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Edward made you doubt yourself, made you believe you couldn't trust your own perceptions." "Yes," Mary confirmed. "And even though my mind knows that you're nothing like him, that what I feel for you is nothing like what I felt for him, my heart is still scared. Fear is natural after what you've been through," Ben said gently. "I would never expect you to simply forget those experiences or pretend they didn't shape who you are." He hesitated, then continued, "All I'm asking is whether you might be willing to explore these feelings between us at whatever pace feels right to you." Mary looked back at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, the patient strength in his face. In the months she had known him, he had never once raised his voice in anger, never used his physical size to intimidate, never made her feel less than his equal. "The cattle drive will take about 2 months," she said slowly. Perhaps that time apart would help me clear my thoughts, figure out what I truly want." A small smile touched Ben's lips. "That's fair, and I promise, whatever you decide when I return, I'll honor it." As they sat watching the sunset together, not touching but closer than they had ever been before, Mary felt a curious mixture of anticipation and fear. The future stretched before her like an uncharted territory, frightening in its unknowns, but also alive with possibilities she had long since stopped believing in. The day of Ben's departure for the cattle drive dawned clear and warm. Mary rose early to prepare a special breakfast, including the biscuits he had praised on his first morning at the boarding house. When he came downstairs, his saddlebags packed and his hat in his hands, an unexpected lump formed in Mary's throat. 2 months suddenly seemed like an eternity. "I've packed some food for your first day's ride," she said, handing him a carefully wrapped bundle. "Thank you," Ben replied, his voice rough with emotion. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs." Holloway, sensing the tension between them, made herself scarce, mumbling something about linens needing attention upstairs. Left alone in the kitchen, Mary and Ben regarded each other awkwardly, neither quite sure how to say goodbye. "I'll be thinking of you," Ben finally said. "Every day." Mary nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her chest. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped forward and, in a gesture that required more courage than anything she had done since fleeing Chicago, placed her hand lightly on his arm. "Be safe," she whispered. Ben covered her hand with his, warm and gentle. "I will," he promised. "And Mary, if you decide while I'm gone that friendship is all you want from me, that's all right. Having you in my life in any capacity is a gift I never expected." His words brought tears to her eyes. "You are a good man, Benjamin Lawson," she managed to say. "The best I've ever known." Something in Ben's expression changed then, a softening around his eyes that made Mary's heart beat faster. Slowly, telegraphing his movement to give her time to pull away if she wished, he raised his hand to her face. When she didn't flinch or retreat, he gently, reverently touched her cheek, his fingers light as a feather against her skin. It was the first time he had touched her face, and the tenderness of the gesture nearly undid her. Before she could reconsider, Mary turned her head slightly and pressed a soft kiss to his palm, a promise, a possibility. Ben's breath caught audibly. "I'll come back to you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "As soon as I can." Then he was gone, the sound of his boots on the porch steps fading into the early morning quiet. Mary stood in the kitchen doorway, watching until he disappeared down the street toward the ranch where the cattle drive would begin. As she turned back to her duties, she realized that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was looking forward to the future with hope rather than dread. The weeks following Ben's departure took on a strange quality for Mary, simultaneously dragging with the weight of his absence, yet racing by as she found herself busier than ever before. Word had somehow spread through Sierra Vista about Mary's knowledge of medicinal plants. It began with Mrs. Mitchell, who stopped by the boarding house to thank her for saving the calf and to inquire about remedies for her own persistent headaches. Then came the blacksmith's wife, seeking something for her husband's burned hands, the schoolteacher with a persistent cough, the young mother with a colicky infant. Initially hesitant, Mary found herself gradually accepting this new role in the community. She created a small herb garden behind the boarding house with Mrs. Holloway's blessing, growing the most commonly needed plants and carefully labeling each with both its common and Latin names. When patience for that was how she had come to think of them required plants she didn't cultivate, she would venture into the surrounding countryside to gather what was needed. Her growing confidence extended beyond her medicinal work. She began accepting invitations to community gatherings, started attending the ladies' sewing circle at the church, and even found herself offering opinions during town meetings about issues affecting Sierra Vista. Through it all, Ben's absence was a constant ache, but one that reminded her of how much she had grown under his patient encouragement. She found herself looking for things to tell him when he returned amusing stories from the boarding house, new plants she had discovered, small triumphs of courage she had achieved. Every night before sleep, she would recall the sensation of his hand against her cheek, the look in his eyes when she had kissed his palm. The memory no longer brought fear, only a warm anticipation of what might be possible when he returned. 6 weeks into Ben's absence, Mary was tending her herb garden when she heard the unmistakable sound of a carriage stopping in front of the boarding house. Assuming it was a new guest arriving, she continued with her work, only looking up when Mrs. Holloway called her name with unusual urgency. "Mary, Mary, come quickly!" Something in the widow's voice sent a chill through Mary's body. Setting aside her gardening tools, she hurried around to the front of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, standing on the porch beside Mrs. Holloway was Sheriff Taylor, his expression grave as he twisted his hat in his hands. "Miss Parker," he greeted her solemnly. "Could I have a word with you, in private, perhaps?" Cold dread settled in Mary's stomach. "Whatever you have to say, Sheriff, you can say it here," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Sheriff Taylor nodded, his weathered face sympathetic. "A telegram came for me this morning from the Chicago Police Department. They're looking for a Mary Parker, wife of Edward Parker." He watched her face carefully as he spoke. "Description matches you, madam." Mary's legs threatened to give way beneath her, but she forced herself to remain standing. "I see," she managed to say. "And what did this telegram say exactly?" "Says Edward Parker is looking for his wife, who disappeared under concerning circumstances. Says he's worried about her state of mind, claims she was unwell when she left." Anger flared hot and bright through Mary's fear. "Unwell," she repeated, her hand automatically going to the scar at her temple. "Is that what he called it?" Mrs. Holloway moved to stand beside Mary, her presence solid and reassuring. "Sheriff, I've known Mary for over a year now. She's the sanest, most level-headed woman I know." Sheriff Taylor held up a placating hand. "I'm not making any judgments, Mrs. Holloway, just doing my duty in following up on official correspondence." He turned back to Mary. "The telegram asks if we've seen you, and if so, to wire back confirmation so Mr. Parker can come collect you." "And what will you tell them?" Mary asked, her heart pounding so hard she was certain both the sheriff and Mrs. Holloway could hear it. Sheriff Taylor studied her for a long moment, taking in her rigid posture, the fear and defiance warring in her eyes, and the scar that stood out starkly against her pale skin. "Well," he said finally, "I was thinking I might wire back that no one matching that description has been seen in Sierra Vista." A small smile creased his weathered face. "After all, the Mary Parker I know is a respected healer in our community, not some confused runaway in need of collecting." Relief washed over Mary in a dizzying wave. "Thank you," she whispered. The sheriff nodded. "Don't thank me yet. If this Edward Parker is as determined as he seems, a negative response might not discourage him. He might still come looking or send someone who will." "What should I do?" Mary asked, hating the tremor that had returned to her voice. "For now, nothing," Sheriff Taylor advised. "Continue as you have been. I'll keep an eye out for strangers asking questions, and I'll let the station master know to alert me if anyone arrives from Chicago." He placed his hat back on his head. "And Miss Parker, Arizona territory isn't Illinois. Women have more rights here than you might think, including the right not to be dragged back to abusive husbands." After the sheriff left, Mary sank onto the porch steps, her legs finally giving way to the shock and fear. Mrs. Holloway sat beside her, a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He won't take you back there," the older woman assured her fiercely. "None of us would allow it." Mary looked at her, stunned by the protective vehemence in the widow's voice. "You'd stand against him, even though legally he's my husband." "Legal doesn't always mean right," Mrs. Holloway replied firmly. "Besides, you've built a life here, Mary. You've helped half the town with your remedies. You think any of those folks would stand by while some Eastern dandy dragged you away?" She squeezed Mary's shoulder gently. "And then there's Ben." The mention of Ben sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Mary. "Ben won't be back for weeks," she reminded Mrs. Holloway. "And I can't expect him to fight my battles." "That young man would move heaven and earth for you," Mrs. Holloway said with certainty. "Anyone with eyes can see it." Mary didn't respond, but the widow's words settled into her heart, providing a measure of comfort amid the renewed fear. That night, Mary found sleep elusive. She lay awake, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the boarding house, her mind racing with possibilities, few of them pleasant. Edward had found her, or at least, he was looking in the right places now. If he came to Sierra Vista, would she have the courage to stand against him? Or would the sight of him reduce her once more to the terrified, broken woman who had fled Chicago in the dead of night? She thought of Ben, of his steady presence and unwavering support. What would he advise her to do? The answer came clearly. He would remind her of her own strength, of how far she had come. He would stand beside her, not in front of her. With that thought, Mary made a decision. She would not run again. Sierra Vista was her home now, these people her community. If Edward came, she would face him not as the cowering wife he remembered, but as the woman she had become. The next morning, Mary went about her duties with renewed determination. After breakfast, she sought out Sheriff Taylor at his office, her back straight and her voice clear as she told him the full story of her marriage to Edward Parker and her escape to Arizona. "If he comes," she concluded, "I want to face him myself. But I would appreciate your presence and perhaps a legal understanding of my options." The sheriff regarded her with respect. "That's brave, Miss Parker, and smart." He leaned back in his chair. "Territory law isn't entirely clear on these matters, but I know a judge in Tucson who might be able to help. I'll send him a letter today." Mary thanked him and left, feeling lighter despite the shadow of Edward's potential arrival hanging over her. She had taken control of her situation, had sought help on her own terms. It was a significant step away from the helplessness that had defined so much of her past. The days that followed took on a strange dual nature, outwardly normal, as Mary continued her work at the boarding house and her growing practice as a healer. Yet charged with underlying tension as she scanned the face of every newcomer to town for the features she had once sworn to love, honor, and obey. A week after the sheriff's warning, a response came from the judge in Tucson. Sheriff Taylor brought the letter to the boarding house himself, his expression more optimistic than it had been during his last visit. "Judge Wilson says there might be a way forward," he explained as Mary read the carefully worded legal document. "Arizona Territory has more progressive views on divorce than most states, especially in cases of cruelty. If you were to establish residency here, which you already have, and file a petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty, a territorial judge could grant it without your husband's consent or even presence." Mary looked up from the letter, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I could be free of him, legally," Sheriff Taylor nodded. "It would take some time and there would be costs involved, but yes, you could be legally free." Hope bloomed in Mary's chest, not just hope of escaping Edward if he came to Sierra Vista, but hope of a future unshackled from the legal bonds that still tied her to her abuser. "I want to file the petition," she said decisively. "As soon as possible," the sheriff smiled. "I thought you might." "Judge Wilson will be riding circuit in a few weeks, stopping in Sierra Vista. He's agreed to hear your case then." After he left, Mary sat in the parlor for a long time, the judge's letter in her hands. Divorce was scandalous in most circles, something respectable women simply didn't do. But the prospect of true freedom, legal, recognized freedom, outweighed any concerns about propriety or reputation. More than anything, she found herself wishing Ben were there to share this development with. Would he understand her decision? Would he support her taking such a controversial step? The answer, when she allowed herself to be honest, was yes. Ben had never once judged her for her past or the choices she had made to survive. He would stand with her in this, as he had in all things. The thought crystallized something in Mary's heart. The feelings she had for Ben went beyond gratitude or friendship or even attraction. Somewhere in the midst of his patient kindness and unwavering respect, she had fallen in love with him deeply, completely, in a way she had never experienced before. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it brought a profound sense of peace. This love wasn't built on desperation or social expectation or a young girl's romantic notions. It was founded on mutual respect, on shared values, on the genuine joy they found in each other's company. Whether Ben returned those feelings in equal measure remained to be seen. But for the first time, Mary allowed herself to hope for a future that included not just freedom from Edward, but the possibility of a life shared with someone who truly saw and valued her. 2 more weeks passed with no sign of Edward or anyone asking questions about Mary. The circuit judge was due in 3 days, and Mary had prepared her petition with the sheriff's help, documenting as much as she could bear to remember about the abuse she had suffered. She was in the garden, harvesting mint for Mrs. Holloway's afternoon tea, when she heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching the boarding house. Multiple horses, moving at a steady trot. Setting down her basket, Mary straightened and listened, her heart beginning to race. It was too early for the stagecoach, and deliveries usually came by wagon. These were riders, several of them, by the sound. Wiping her hands on her apron, she moved toward the front of the house, caution in every step. As she rounded the corner, she stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. 4 riders had pulled up in front of the boarding house. 3 were strangers, trail-worn men with the look of a cattle drive about them, but the 4th, Ben, she whispered, hardly believing her eyes. He was dustier than she'd ever seen him, his clothes showing the wear of weeks on the trail, his face tanned even darker by the Kansas sun. But his smile when he spotted her was as bright as the day he'd left, his eyes warming with unmistakable joy. "Mary," he replied, dismounting in one fluid motion. He removed his hat, revealing hair in need of a trim, and took a step toward her, then stopped, seeming to remember his appearance. "I'm sorry to arrive like this. We pushed hard the last few days. I needed to see you." Mary felt a smile breaking across her face, wider and more genuine than any she had managed in his absence. "You're early," she said, her voice stronger than she would have expected given the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Ben nodded. "We made good time on the return journey. The other men will bring the remaining cattle at a more reasonable pace, but Mr. Mitchell allowed me to ride ahead with these fellows." He gestured to his companions, who were watching the exchange with poorly concealed interest. Mary became suddenly aware of her appearance, hair escaping from its pins, dirt from the garden smudging her apron, cheeks flushed from the heat and now from the joy of seeing Ben again. "You must be tired," she said, recovering her composure somewhat. "Hungry too, I imagine. Come inside, all of you. I'm sure Mrs. Holloway can find rooms for your friends." Ben's companions dismounted, leading their horses toward the hitching post with knowing grins directed at Ben's back. It was clear they had some inkling of the reason for their foreman's haste to reach Sierra Vista. As they entered the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway emerged from the kitchen, her surprise at the unexpected guests giving way to understanding when she saw Ben among them. "Well, Mr. Lawson," she said with a barely suppressed smile, "you're back earlier than expected." "Yes, madam," Ben replied, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "I hope my usual room is available." "It is indeed," the widow confirmed. "As it happens, I've been holding it for you. Mary insisted we shouldn't rent it to anyone else until we knew for certain you weren't returning." Now it was Mary's turn to blush as Ben's gaze turned to her, a question in his eyes. "I thought you might want to stay here again," she explained hastily. "When you returned, I mean." Ben's smile deepened. "I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotion, until Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat. "Well, let me show your friends to their rooms, Mr. Lawson. I imagine you and Mary have some catching up to do." After the others had gone upstairs, Mary and Ben stood in the parlor, suddenly awkward in their first moment alone after 2 months apart. "You look well," Ben said finally, his eyes taking in the subtle changes in her, the straighter posture, the more direct gaze, the quiet confidence that hadn't been there when he left. "More than well. You look radiant." Mary smiled, the compliment warming her from within. "And you look exhausted," she replied, though her tone was teasing. "Sit down before you fall down. I'll bring you something to eat." Ben sank gratefully into one of the parlor chairs. "I've missed this place," he said, looking around the familiar room. "Missed the quiet, the comfort." His eyes found hers again. "Missed you most of all." The simple honesty of his words touched Mary deeply. "I missed you too," she admitted. "More than I expected to." She went to the kitchen and prepared a tray with cold chicken, bread, cheese, and a large glass of lemonade. When she returned, Ben accepted the food with heartfelt thanks, his hunger evident in the way he fell upon the simple meal. Mary sat across from him, content to watch him eat, to absorb the reality of his presence after so many weeks of absence. There was so much she wanted to tell him about her growing practice as a healer, about Edward's inquiry about the petition for divorce, but all of that could wait. For now, it was enough that he was here, safe and whole. "The drive went well?" she asked when he had taken the edge off his hunger. Ben nodded. "Better than expected. Prices were good in Kansas, weather held, and we didn't lose many head along the way." He took a long drink of lemonade. "Mr. Mitchell was pleased enough that he's offered me a permanent position managing his ranch." Mary's heart leaped at his words. "You'd be staying in Sierra Vista if I accept?" "Yes," Ben confirmed, his eyes steady on hers. "I'd be based here year-round, only leaving for the annual drives." "And have you decided?" Mary asked, hardly daring to breathe. Ben set down his glass, his expression turning serious. "That depends on what I find here," he said quietly. "On whether the reason I was hoping for has materialized." Mary's pulse quickened. "And what reason would that be?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "You," Ben said simply. "The hope that you might feel for me what I feel for you." Mary's breath caught in her throat. "Ben, I understand if you need more time," he added quickly. "Or if you've decided that friendship is all you want from me. I meant what I said before I left. Having you in my life in any capacity is more than I ever expected." Mary rose from her chair and moved to stand before him, closer than she had ever willingly placed herself to any man since her escape from Chicago. "I don't need more time," she said softly, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "These past weeks have been clarifying." Hope dawned in Ben's eyes. "Clarifying how?" "I've realized that what I feel for you isn't just gratitude or friendship," Mary explained, her courage growing with each word. "It's deeper than that, stronger." Ben stood slowly, careful to maintain the small space between them. "Mary," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "Are you saying?" "I love you," she said, the words surprisingly easy once she allowed them voice. "I love your patience, your kindness, the way you've never once made me feel broken or damaged. I love that you've seen my strength even when I couldn't see it myself." Ben's eyes glistened with emotion. "May I touch you?" he asked, the question so characteristic of his constant respect for her boundaries that Mary felt her heart swell even further. In response, she closed the distance between them and tentatively placed her hands on his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. "I'm not afraid of you, Ben," she whispered. "I never have been, not really." With infinite gentleness, Ben raised his hands to cradle her face, his thumbs brushing softly across her cheekbones. "I love you, Mary Parker," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "more than I've ever loved anyone or anything in this world." Mary leaned into his touch, savoring the tenderness of it. Then, gathering all her newfound courage, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his in a soft, questioning kiss. Ben responded with equal gentleness, letting her set the pace, following her lead. It was nothing like the demanding, possessive kisses Edward had forced upon her. This was an offering, a communion, a promise exchanged between equals. When they parted, Mary's eyes were bright with unshed tears, not of fear or pain, but of joy and wonder at the realization that she could feel this way, that her past had not robbed her of the capacity for this kind of connection. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, reluctant to break the moment but knowing he needed to understand the full situation. "About my husband, my former husband." Ben listened without interruption as Mary explained about the telegram from Chicago, the sheriff's warning, and her decision to file for divorce. When she finished, his expression was resolute. "You've done the right thing," he assured her. "And I'll stand with you through all of it, however you need me to." "Even though divorce is scandalous?" Mary asked, needing to be certain. "Even though some people might judge you for associating with me afterward?" Ben's smile held a touch of defiance. "Let them judge. I know your worth, Mary, and so does anyone in this town who matters." His expression softened. "Besides, I'm just a cowboy. We're not exactly known for our adherence to society's rules." Mary laughed, the sound bright and free in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. No, I suppose not. Ben's expression grew more serious. If Edward Parker comes to Sierra Vista, he'll find that you're not alone anymore. You have friends here, people who care about you, and you have me for whatever that's worth. It's worth everything, Mary replied, her voice strong with conviction. But this is my battle to fight, Ben. I need to face him myself if he comes. Ben nodded, respect evident in his eyes. I understand, and I'll be right behind you, ready to help if you need it, but not stepping in front of you. He smiled slightly. You're the strongest person I know, Mary Parker. Edward Parker doesn't stand a chance against the woman you've become. His faith in her, his understanding of her need to stand on her own, filled Mary with a warmth that chased away the last lingering shadows of fear. Whatever came next, whether Edward appeared or not, whether the judge granted her petition or not, she would face it with Ben beside her, supporting her without diminishing her. 3 days later, Judge Wilson arrived in Sierra Vista as scheduled. Mary presented her petition in the privacy of Sheriff Taylor's office, her voice steady as she answered the judge's questions about her marriage and the abuse she had suffered. Ben waited outside during the proceeding, honoring Mary's wish to handle this part alone, but his supportive presence just beyond the door gave her strength when the memories threatened to overwhelm her. Well, Miss Parker, Judge Wilson said when she had finished her testimony, your petition is in order and your grounds for divorce are unfortunately all too clear. The older man's kind eyes held genuine sympathy. I'm granting your request. The divorce will be final once it's published in the territorial newspaper, which should take about 3 weeks. Mary closed her eyes briefly, relief washing through her. Thank you, Your Honor. There is one more matter, the judge continued, shuffling through his papers. Sheriff Taylor mentioned that your husband has made inquiries about your whereabouts if he contests the divorce. He won't, Mary said with unexpected certainty. Edward cares too much about his reputation in Chicago society, a public divorce case detailing his behaviors would damage that reputation irreparably. He'd rather pretend I died than acknowledge the truth. Judge Wilson nodded gravely. Let us hope you're right, but if he does appear, contact me immediately. I've included language in the decree that prohibits him from harassing or threatening you in any way. When Mary emerged from the sheriff's office, divorce decree in hand, Ben stood immediately, his eyes searching her face. It's done, she told him, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. In 3 weeks, I'll legally be Mary Parker and no one's wife. Ben's smile was radiant. Congratulations, he said softly, offering his arm to escort her back to the boarding house. How does it feel? Mary considered the question as they walked. Like the last chain has been broken, she finally replied. Like I can finally look forward without constantly glancing over my shoulder. That evening, after dinner, Ben asked Mary to walk with him in the garden behind the boarding house. The air was warm but not uncomfortable, filled with the scent of the herbs Mary had so carefully cultivated over the past months. They strolled in companionable silence for a while, eventually sitting on the small bench beneath the desert willow tree that provided shade for the garden during the hottest part of the day. I accepted Mr. Mitchell's offer today, Ben said, turning slightly to face Mary in the gathering dusk. I'll be the permanent ranch manager starting next week. Mary smiled, happiness blooming within her. That's wonderful news. You'll be excellent at it. It means I'll be staying in Sierra Vista, Ben continued, his voice taking on a note of significance. Building a life here. I'm glad, Mary replied softly. Ben took her hand gently in his. Mary, I know today has been momentous for you, and I don't want to overwhelm you with too much at once, but I also don't want to waste any more time dancing around what I feel for you. He took a deep breath. I love you. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me. Mary's heart swelled with emotion. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Benjamin Lawson? A smile crinkled the corners of Ben's eyes. I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife once your divorce is final. He squeezed her hand gently. Not right away, only when you're ready. We could have a long engagement, get to know each other better, make sure it's truly what you want. Ben, Mary interrupted his careful qualifications, her voice gentle but firm. I don't need more time to know that I love you and want to spend my life with you. She paused, considering. But yes, perhaps a proper courtship would be wise, if only to satisfy the town gossips. Ben laughed, the sound rich with joy and relief. Is that a yes, then? Yes, Mary confirmed, her heart lighter than she could remember it being since childhood. Yes, I will marry you, Ben Lawson, when the time is right. Ben raised her hand to his lips, pressing a tender kiss to her knuckles. You've made me the happiest man in Arizona territory, he said, his voice husky with emotion. As they sat together in the twilight, planning their future in quiet, hopeful conversation, Mary marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terrified woman who had stepped off the train in Sierra Vista with nothing but bruises and broken dreams, to this, a woman with purpose, strength, and the love of a good man who saw her exactly as she was and cherished her for it. 3 weeks later, Mary's divorce became final. The newspaper containing the notice arrived on the morning stage, and Sheriff Taylor brought it directly to the boarding house, where Mary read the simple legal announcement with a sense of profound closure. "Congratulations, Miss Parker," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "You're officially a free woman." That evening, Ben took Mary to dinner at the town's only restaurant, a public declaration of their courtship that set the local gossips buzzing with approval. Most of Sierra Vista had already guessed at the growing attachment between the quiet healer and the respectful cowboy, and the general sentiment was that they made a fine match. Their courtship proceeded at a pace that honored Mary's continued healing while allowing their relationship to deepen naturally. Ben was unfailingly patient, always letting Mary determine the boundaries of physical affection, celebrating each small step forward without pushing for more. 6 months after her divorce became final, on a crisp October morning, Mary Parker became Mary Lawson in a simple ceremony at the Sierra Vista Church, surrounded by the community that had become her family, Mrs. Holloway wept openly as she straightened Mary's veil, declaring that she had never seen a more beautiful bride or a more deserving couple. When Mary walked down the aisle to where Ben waited, his eyes shining with love and pride, she felt none of the trepidation that had marked her first wedding. This union was not built on a young girl's desperate need to escape her parents' home, or a society that valued women only as wives and mothers. This marriage was a choice made freely by a woman who knew her own worth, who entered the partnership as an equal, bringing her own strengths and values to complement those of the man she loved. After the ceremony, the entire town gathered for a celebration at the Mitchell Ranch, where Ben had built a small but comfortable house for their new life together. It sat on a rise overlooking the valley, with ample space for Mary to expand her medicinal garden and continue her healing work. Edward Parker never came to Sierra Vista. Whether deterred by the sheriff's response to his inquiry or simply unwilling to expend the effort once the initial rage at Mary's escape had subsided, he remained in Chicago, eventually remarrying according to a newspaper Mary's parents sent in their first tentative letter after learning of her new marriage. Mary responded to her parents with a polite but firm letter, establishing boundaries while leaving the door open for a relationship based on mutual respect, something that had been lacking in their previous interactions. It was a testament to her growth, Ben told her proudly, that she could extend such grace while still protecting herself. 2 years after their wedding, Mary gave birth to a son they named Thomas, after Ben's father. He was a strong, healthy baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's thoughtful eyes. Watching Ben cradle their son with such gentleness, Mary felt her heart might burst with contentment. "He's perfect," Ben whispered, awe in his voice as he counted tiny fingers and toes for perhaps the 100th time. "He is," Mary agreed, reaching out to touch the downy head nestled against Ben's chest. "And so lucky to have you for a father." Ben looked up, his eyes serious despite his smile. "I promise you both, I will never be the kind of husband or father who rules through fear. Our home will always be a place of safety and respect." "I know," Mary said simply, complete trust in her voice. "That's who you are, Ben Lawson. It's why I fell in love with you." As Thomas grew, he was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, named for Mary's grandmother who had taught her about healing plants. The Lawson home became known throughout Sierra Vista as a place of warmth and welcome, with Mary's reputation as a healer bringing a steady stream of patients seeking both her remedies and her compassionate counsel. Ben's management of the Mitchell Ranch proved so successful that he eventually became a partner in the operation, providing a stable future for their growing family. He remained as he had always been steady, kind, and unfailingly supportive of Mary's independence and work in the community. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their home watching their children play in the yard, Mary reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of profound peace and joy. "What are you thinking about?" Ben asked, reaching over to take her hand as he had done countless times over the years, each touch a reminder of the respect that formed the foundation of their relationship. "About how far I've come," Mary replied, squeezing his hand. "About how different my life might have been if I hadn't found the courage to leave Chicago, or if you hadn't been so patient with a frightened woman who could barely look you in the eye." Ben smiled, the lines around his eyes deeper now but no less appealing. "You always had the strength inside you, Mary. I just had the privilege of watching you discover it." Mary leaned against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that the fears that had once defined her existence had been replaced by love, trust, and the quiet confidence that came from being truly seen and valued. "I love you, Benjamin Lawson," she said simply. "And I love you, Mary Lawson," he replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Today and always." As the Arizona sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in the same vibrant colors that had backdropped their first real conversation in the Wildflower Valley years before, Mary breathed a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances, for the healing power of patience and kindness, and for the man beside her who had never tried to fix her, but had simply created the safe space in which she could rebuild herself.